Again, thank you all for joining us. I'll kick things off rather with just a little bit of introductions before we turn it over to our speakers. So my name is Brittany Collins. I'm the Assistant Director of Times Square Arts, which, if you're unaware, is the public art program of the Times Square Alliance. And we collaborate with contemporary artists and cultural institutions to experiment and engage with one of the world's most iconic public places through a variety of forms. And one of our favorite programs we present is the Midnight Moment, which, if you haven't heard, is the world's largest and longest running digital public art program. So every night from 11:57 to midnight, you can see public art presented on a truly monumental scale across 100 electronic billboards throughout Times Square, almost 100. And tonight, we're here on the occasion of May's Midnight Moment, Liquid Gold by Ilana Harris-Babou, which was guest curated by Pamela Council, who's another Midnight Moment alum. And for the next hour, you'll hear from Ilana Harris-Babou and special guest, Dr. Jennifer C. Nash, in a conversation moderated by Pamela Council. But before I turn it over to them, I'll share their bios. So Ilana is an interdisciplinary artist whose work spans sculpture and installation and video and examines the ways we find community and identity in everyday objects. She has presented her work at a range of arts institutions, including the Highline, Art Space, Kunsthaus Hamburg, the ICA in Chattanooga, Tennessee, the Museum of Arts and Design, the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum, Istanbul Design Biennial, and the Whitney Biennial. Letdown Reflex, a video piece related to May's Midnight Moment, Liquid Gold, is currently on view at Wellcome Collection in London until September 13th. Dr. Jennifer C. Nash is Jean Fox-Robar Professor of Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies at Duke University. She earned her PhD in African American Studies at Harvard University and her JD at Harvard Law School. Her new book is Birthing Black Mothers, which examines how the figure of the Black mother has become a powerful political category. She has previously published 2 other books with Duke University Press, The Black Body in Ecstasy, Reading Race, Reading Pornography, and Black Feminism Reimagined, After Intersectionality. Pamela Council is a New York-based interdisciplinary artist using sculpture, writing, and performance to create multisensory dedications. Council's practice embodies a darkly humorous, maximalist, and inventive Afro-Americana camp aesthetic termed Blaxidermy. In addition to their 2021 Times Square Arts Commission, A Fountain for Survivors, and the Midnight Moment entitled Talking Hands, Watch My Nails, Don't Watch Me, Council's work has been presented at the New Museum, United States Library of Congress, Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, Studio Museum, Nike, and Mokata. They're a recipient of the 2017 Joan Mitchell Painters and Sculptors Grant, 2020 Harpo Foundation Grant, and a 2023 Guggenheim Fellowship. So we're gathered here around Ilana's Midnight Moment, entitled Liquid Gold. And Liquid Gold features mesmerizing movements of cream-colored bubbles made from frothy milk and baby formula ingredients. It's inspired by Ilana's research on the experience of Black motherhood. The work examines the invisible labor of breastfeeding and the unique role of milk within broader global and political economies. Tonight, you'll hear our 3 speakers explore the themes behind this work and the intersections within their research and practices, including Black feminist theory, Black maternal health, and Black mothers' experiences. Before I turn it over to them, I think we'll get a glimpse at Liquid Gold right now.
You will have all the pretty little horses.
And without further ado, I'll turn it over to our next speaker and moderator, Pamela Council.
Thank you, Brittany, for that introduction. Thank you, Ilana and Dr. Nash, for being here today. I'm super grateful to be able to be here with you and host this conversation where we can continue to draw these connections between your work. Just a little bit about how I came to this position. I invited Ilana because I'm so inspired by the way that she uses the existing forms of pop culture to show us which stories were being sold. I think this current body of work exploring Black motherhood and breastfeeding and this material culture study of milk brings this intimate political conversation to the Times Square jumbotrons. This work, of course, is inspired by Dr. Nash's examination and troubling of Black motherhood as a political category and site, where she's inviting us to see a multitude of ways of considering Black motherhood. So I'm super delighted to be with you both and talk about your work.
Thank you. Am I up next? I'm guessing I'm probably up next. I just wanted to take a moment to share some context around the work with the audience. You saw how it kind of looks in Times Square with those big frothing bubbles across several screens. But it's kind of an extension of a longer body of work that began a little bit more than a year ago when the folks at the Welcome Collection, which is a sort of a medical research archive that also curates thematic shows with works by contemporary artists and historical artifacts in London. They approached me saying that they were going to have an exhibition up about milk and asked me if I had anything that might make sense or if there are any ideas that I could explore. And I had made a work with my mom in the past called Decision Fatigue that looked at wellness culture, where my mom kind of played this beauty influencer. But in it, she describes her daily beauty routine for not breastfeeding, which was kind of a joke on this sort of idealized versions of white motherhood I had seen often in wellness culture, but also was sort of just something my mom wanted to talk about because she personally found breastfeeding a kind of dissociative, terrible experience that she wouldn't wish on her worst enemy. But it made me start to think about what the kind of multitude of varied experiences had, of course, by all Black mothers, but particularly the mothers in my family, where for my sister, it was something that was kind of really empowering after the experience of having a traumatic birth to have this element of motherhood that she could control. And so I thought that I would expand upon these stories for the piece for the Welcome Collection. And so the music that you heard there is kind of the crescendo of a longer soundtrack that is based off of All the Pretty Little Horses, which is a lullaby that some folks believe originated during the time of slavery and was sung by Black mothers who had to leave their children to take care of white children, but the origin isn't exactly known. But so I'll just say that I used the kind of melody from that song as a starting point for the piece and asked my relatives to sort of sing and hum different versions of it. And I'm going to share my screen now to share an excerpt of the video with you all.
it's like something, I don't know if it's coming from me or coming from the baby. I'm not going to blame the baby, but the way the breast fills when lactation occurs, it's like it rushes down through to your breast, and it's very painful, and like you have to relieve your breast of this milk that has accumulated. It's like something that is a foreign entity, really, that has come to you and is draining you of your life force. To me, I didn't, that's the way I felt about it. I didn't feel that I needed to do it, and I don't like pain. So hey, it's really all about me and my needs, really. When she came into the little room, she unbuttoned her blouse and smiled. She was too young to be dazzled by her nipples, but she was old enough to be bored by the flat taste of mother's milk. So she came reluctantly, as to a chore, and lay as she had at least once each day of her life in her mother's arms, and tried to pull the thin, faintly sweet milk from her flesh without hurting her with her teeth. She felt her restraint, her courtesy, her indifference, all of which pushed her into fantasy. She had the distinct impression that her lips were pulling from her a thread of light. It was as though she was a cauldron issuing spinning gold. Like the miller's daughter, the one who sat at night in the straw-filled room, thrilled with the secret power Rumpelstiltskin had given her, to see golden threads stream from her very own shuttle. And that was the other part of her pleasure, a pleasure she hated to give up.
So I will share also with you all a link in the chat after I'm, after I'm done sharing images. But this is just to show you how it's installed at Welcome Collection, where it's sort of the seating arrangement that are made out of adult-sized nursing pillows, the kinds babies would be in, that you can sit in to watch the video. The wallpaper and the kind of transparencies you saw are sort of like archival, sort of Victorian era pumping tools that are in the Welcome Collections archives collection. And I've also shown the work in this installation where you kind of sit in these big sort of seats, and then you have this sculpture on a table that's sort of pumping a milky liquid constantly through these ceramic objects. So that's more context surrounding the piece in the ways that I've shown it in the past. And I'm sure that while we discuss the work, you'll be able to ask me whatever other questions you have. There's a link to the full video in the chat now. But now I would love to introduce Dr. Nash, whose work I came upon about a year ago. Definitely last summer when I was working on this piece, and was so excited to spend time with while I was still in the space of iteration. And so I'm just so honored that you're able to join us here today to be able to be in conversation around the work.
Thank you for having me, Ilana. It's so amazing to see your work. And thanks for all of you for being here. I'm also going to share my screen, so just give me one moment. Okay. Okay. So I was going to share a little bit about some of what I was thinking about around Black breastfeeding in my book, Birthing Black Mothers. And as I said, I have a couple of images I want to talk about that I think overlap with some of what you're thinking about in your work, Ilana. So I wanted to start with this image, this advertisement from The Gap. So in February 2018, The Gap launched its newest advertising campaign on Instagram. And it was this image that you see here with a simple slogan, "Love your forever favorite." One image, the one that's on your screen now, featured a Black woman wearing a weathered Gap t-shirt, breastfeeding her child. While the advertisement was supposed to be for Gap's new intimate apparel line, the shirt's brand name was hidden, as was the maternal model's face, leaving the viewer to gaze upon the nursing Black child, his mother's hand tenderly resting on his back. In a Washington Post article, the journalist Rochon Meadows Fernandez celebrated the advertisement. She wrote, it is epic for a multitude of reasons. She is a dark-skinned Black woman. She is a Black woman with a wedding ring, and she is breastfeeding a toddler. The crown of curls and coils atop both the mother and child's head symbolize multicultural beauty and is a simple yet powerful reflection of the Black family. In an era when the Gap sales were, in the words of Forbes magazine, dismal, the ad was, as Forbes noted, the kind of win Gap needs right now. Evidence of the company's commitment to, quote, supporting Black women who choose to breastfeed. A year before the Gap celebrated advertisement hit Instagram, the New York Times reported on a Black breastfeeding gap. The article reported that 61% of Black mothers initiated breastfeeding compared to 78% of white mothers. The study's authors found that the gap was due to multiple forces, including medical institutions' failure to encourage Black women to breastfeed and Black women's relative unfamiliarity with breastfeeding, since they were more likely to come from families where breastfeeding was not practiced. Importantly, the study and the article emphasized that Black women are unsupported rather than unwilling breastfeeders. The study also warned against the particular danger of formula's ubiquitous presence in maternity wards, noting that, quote, changing hospital relationships with formula companies that relinquish fiscal dependency on free formula is a notorious challenge for many hospitals that strive to improve breastfeeding outcomes. The hailing of formula companies as the genesis of the Black breastfeeding crisis shored up the notion that corporations could be the source of racial inequity, particularly when they made their presence felt in the maternity ward. Ultimately, the study's findings underscored that Black breasts were in crisis and that nothing short of a wholesale effort to champion their productive capacities was necessary. So I begin with a Gap image and the celebration around it and media coverage of lagging Black breastfeeding rates to think about how Black breastfeeding has been treated as one of the many sites of crisis in Black maternal health. And you might think of some of the other kind of sites of crisis, Black C-section rates, Black infant mortality rates, Black maternal mortality rates. The crisis in non-Black breastfeeding has been responded to in a host of ways, including efforts by the state to encourage and sometimes compel Black breastfeeding, through baby-friendly hospitals which support breastfeeding efforts, and through ban the bag campaigns. There was one in New York that prohibit formula companies from providing samples to new parents in the hospitals. The crisis has also been responded to visually, from state efforts to advertise breastfeeding to work by Black feminist artists. This is a billboard from Philadelphia that the Department of Health put up. It's a photograph taken by a Black feminist photographer named Vanessa Simmons. If breast milk, particularly colostrum, has been celebrated as liquid gold, as a nutritional superfood that cannot be replicated by formula companies, no matter their efforts, Black feminist artists have represented breast milk as Black gold. And I use that term to describe the benefits that breast milk is thought to confer on Black infants, who are more likely to experience precarity, violence, and proximity to trauma, even in utero. For these artists, Black breast milk is a critical inoculation against vulnerability and a kind of physical and emotional nurturance that provides far more than physical satiety. And so I'm also thinking about work by the photographer Lakeisha Cohill, who's a Birmingham, Alabama-based photographer who made her career out of doing Black breastfeeding photographs. So these are two that I write about in my book. And her career became sort of more visible when she, when she took this image of a Black feminist mothers group called the Chocolate Milk Mommies in Birmingham, Alabama, who were organized around supporting each other breastfeeding. And this image went viral during one of the National Black Breastfeeding Weeks. So I'm really interested in this kind of visual efforts to support or champion Black breastfeeding. So in closing, in a 2013 article introducing the start of Black Breastfeeding Week, Kimberly Sears Allers, who is a strong advocate of Black breastfeeding, reminded her readers, quote, "We have to save ourselves. We have to ask ourselves why we find it quite okay to use breasts to sell chicken wings and beer or to backdrop our music videos, but we are, quote, uncomfortable seeing a mother feed her child." Allers' call for saving ourselves underscores that salvation and empowerment for many takes a visual form. She insists that we replace a comfort with using breasts to sell chicken wings with images of Black breastfeeding, replacing sexualized Black breasts with reproductive Black breasts. And I have a lot to say about that. We could talk more about it in Q&A. Her comment also suggests that the effort to re-signify Black breasts begins with visual culture, with art, and with artists' sustained efforts to remake our collective understanding not just of Black breasts, but also of Black women's bodies. So thank you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Wow, I'll go into our questions. Thank you both for your presentations. I just want to write one note on the trading of the sexualized breast for the maternal breast. I thought that that mention of chocolate milk was really funny because Ilana, in your video, there's a part, right, about adding chocolate syrup to the formula.
Yeah, in an earlier version. So usually the way I often work is that I'll like kind of have one set of ideas and then I keep iterating it through like various edits and versions of the piece. So the first time I showed it, where that version was called liquid gold, then let down reflex, and then liquid gold again. The first version, I was really interested in the sculptures I showed too, and kind of color space of like white and brown and beige. And so in that one, my sister shares her memories of, she started adding chocolate syrup to my formula when I was a baby. And then I kind of refused to ever look back and have any other tone of milk ever again. But I was really interested in that moment because she thought of it as like an act of love and sort of bonding between the two of us. And obviously there's that element of my sister being she was a teen or almost a child herself, you know, when she took it upon herself to do that.
It was sweet of her, even if it isn't the right thing.
Yeah.
So my first question for both of you is, in both of your practices, I can see you like thinking about Black motherhood and also making an effort to sort of unflatten our notions of Black motherhood or the popular notion of it. Can you talk a little bit more about your strategies for grounding into that?
I can speak about, I think that it evolves. I often work with my mom in my work in lots of different iterations. So we've done like a kind of a cooking show that uses Audre Lorde's uses of the erotic as a starting point for like a hypothetical recipe. We've done a sort of a home improvement show, Fixer Upper, together, where it's kind of this old house style, and we're finishing a raw basement supposedly, but also maybe offering ideas for reparations. We've worked together, like I mentioned, the piece Decision Fatigue, which is she's a beauty influencer, but also I was thinking about how so often in the space of being well, personal sort of structural issues are framed as personal decisions. So and that as well. And so I like this idea of being a mother that's existing outside of the expectations of either Black motherhood in general, but not necessarily that existing on a spectrum from good mom to bad mom, but just sort of like complicated mom, or that there's roles of who is the mom between the two of us, or the conveyance of intergenerational knowledge could get messy and also sort of playful. And so this was the first time where I also got to speak with sort of laterally, generationally with my sister, and then also with my niece about her thoughts about formula, right, which are very much formed. What are an 11-year-old's thoughts on formula? I was really curious about the narratives she was getting about what motherhood meant, even while still being a child. And so I think I'm always kind of circling around or circling back to what it can mean and trying to complicate things.
Yeah, just building on that. I mean, Ilana, when you were mentioning ideas of good motherhood and bad motherhood, I was thinking about how so many of us mother with the specter of failing always, and how Black motherhood is attached to being to badness in a certain kind of a way in the cultural imaginary, right? And so as you were talking, I was thinking that what really resonates with me about your work and what you were even showing today is an attention to the complexities around maternal feelings around infant feeding, right? That we can dislike breastfeeding, we can want to avoid it, we can disavow it, we can be bored, it can be painful, it can be erotic, it can be sensual, that it can be all of those things simultaneously. And there hasn't been a lot of cultural space for naming those complexities. I think especially now where breastfeeding is a kind of mark of middle class or affluent good motherhood, right? To name, like, I might not want to do that for any reason, for a host of reasons, is to actually name that one is not a good mother, or a good enough mother. And so, to get back to your question, Pam, like, I'm really interested in how choices about infant feeding are made in a social and historical and medical context that make our choices that shape our choices in some way, or even constrict our choices. So when I think about when I gave birth to my daughter 7 years ago in a baby-friendly hospital, I put baby-friendly in quotes, and said over and over again, like, I'm not breastfeeding, just FYI, I'm not breastfeeding, not breastfeeding, not breastfeeding. I became marked in a certain kind of a way as a bad patient, and found that at every step of the way, I had somebody who wanted to educate me about how the choice that I was making was actually a bad one for myself and my baby. And so it was really interesting to find myself in a moment in which I had to constantly reassert that, no, I'm a good mother. I'm an educated patient, right? Like, I'm exerting my choice. So I'm really interested in how, I guess the last piece is like the pendulum swings so much over the historical period around breastfeeding. So I was thinking, when I had my daughter, I talked to my mother about breastfeeding, and I said to her, did you breastfeed me? And she said, I did, for 3 days. And I was like, oh my. And she was sort of like, I don't understand why this is a big deal. Like, I was born in 1980, and she said, none of my friends breastfed. Like, formula was considered liberating for us. It's what allowed us to go back to work. So she was so surprised to hear how much breastfeeding had become the hallmark of good mothering for our generation. So it's also interesting just to think about this kind of longer historical view about how ideas about good and bad mothering, attachment parenting, and the like change in different historical contexts.
Yeah, I think for me, working on the piece was very interesting because my mom was a pediatric nurse for more than 30 years. So what she was told or told patients sometimes aligned with her own feelings about what she wanted to do with her body, and sometimes totally didn't, depending on what the norms were at the time in the hospital. She worked primarily in Black communities as a pediatric nurse. So she might at sometimes be saying, you should definitely breastfeed your baby, while also being like, but I know, at the same time.
Sorry, I know, Pamela, you have other questions. I just wanted to add, I think it's also so interesting how these medical interventions around Black breastfeeding are often not about breastfeeding at all. So like, one of the things I write about in my book is a kind of like early 1990s to 2000s state obsession with getting Black women to breastfeed, because breastfeeding is seen as a way out of the obesity epidemic. And so there's a sense of like, oh, well, if women breastfeed, they'll lose weight. And also this public health discourse that children who are breastfed are less likely to be obese. And so suddenly breastfeeding is promoted as something that's good for the fiscal health of the state, because we need to have less obese citizens, right? To be a healthy and economically healthy state. And so it's interesting to think about what political work the advocacy for Black breastfeeding is performing in different moments, right? Because sometimes as I started this research, I thought it was about conscripting Black women into performing attachment parenting, or like teaching Black women how to attach properly to their children. And then I became really surprised to like look at this public health literature and be like, oh, wow, actually a lot of this is about a kind of highly racialized concern with obesity. So it's interesting to think about the issues that get swept into breastfeeding and that are all about the ways in which Black bodies generally and Black women's bodies specifically are marked as a problem for the state.
Wow, thank you both. Yeah, that's the way it becomes, it's a political agenda and then also bleeds into the advertising. I mean, you starting with that Gap ad, I feel like that's something we might see in Times Square during the day on the billboards, you know, or at least a cropping of it as one of the big advertisers there. With this work, I'm super interested in like how we're taking this super intimate material and putting it on the big screen, you know, and just what that can mean. And so I'm curious for both of you, like, you know, this work is being presented in Times Square, and Ilana, like on 2 different continents, and Dr. Nash, you're publishing, you know, about this subject. So I'm curious what you want the broader audience to take away, as well as like Black mothers specifically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's like, it's shifted like when I've actually seen what happens to it also when I install it and like what responses. I think like I got to show it first at Wesleyan University where I teach and get a lot of feedback from a very thoughtful, captive audience of academics, and having some feedback like that, you know, the piece made them feel anxious because of the heartbeats, or that it triggered like an actual letdown reflex feeling in a mother, you know, or wanting to also be thinking about how I dealt with the archival imagery from Welcome collection, because they have a lot of imagery of Black mothers breastfeeding that are like sort of colonial images, or like UNICEF images to get mothers in Africa to breastfeed that are sometimes at once eroticized and also claiming to be about health. And so in the beginning, even some of that imagery was in there, and then I realized it really wasn't serving the purpose that I wanted or needed at all. And so I decided to stay in the space of, in terms of the human body, it's like implied, and then it exists in the space of voice, and like both subjectivity and, you know, vocal humming and things like that are where stories are communicated. First, the audience becomes, you know, me and my mom and my sister watching my mom talk to me, and my niece watching me talk to my sister. So every time I make my work, first, it's kind of like this excuse to kind of hang out with my loved ones and be like an audience to one another and our own memories and like remembering things. And then thinking about what happens when I take it to different audiences. I know that certain elements of it might be gleaned by different folks, but thinking about how I can at once share intimacy and vulnerability, while also not like performing those things for someone who expects that I owe it to them to do that, has been really interesting.
Yes.
and I think also like showing it in the UK, I like learned about a different situation and conversation there where I didn't even realize the Black maternal death rate is a lot higher there actually than it is in the US.
Yeah, thanks for that. I would just add, I mean, for me, I am really interested in what it means to be part of a group, Black women, that's deemed as in need of support and attention and encouragement by the state, which one of the things I try to think about in my book is how even 20 or 30 years ago, the kind of attention that Black mothers received from the state was that we were pathological and deviant and bad mothers and quote unquote welfare queens. And now the attention that we receive from the state is that the state wants to help us, instruct us, guide us, shape us towards making quote unquote healthy decisions for ourselves and our children. And I'm interested in what it means to be part of a group that it has been determined we require support and uplift and attention. And, you know, with the Gap, I'm really interested in what it means for a corporation to rebuild its image and its brand, like literally off of Black women's flesh. Right? I find that really interesting. And I find that kind of complicated dance where at once, corporations are horrible, so we should not have corporations offering bags of formula in the delivery room, but also it's really great when corporations like the Gap promote Black breastfeeding. So I'm really interested in like the kind of complicated dances that the left in particular does around the relationship between sort of the corporation and Black maternal health. With the breastfeeding chapter, I was, in some ways, this goes to some of what you were saying, Ilana, about privacy and vulnerability. I came to this chapter first in writing this book because I had recently had a baby, and as an academic, I try to make sense of what I do, how I live, what I'm experiencing through research. And so I was really interested in just trying to understand what it meant to be in a cultural moment where my decisions about how I kept my infant alive were seen as political. Like, I was just really interested in what it meant to be part of that moment. And because I am a feminist and delivered with midwives in a baby-friendly hospital, I was presumed to have a certain relationship to infant feeding that when I said, actually, I'm not breastfeeding, caused a problem. And so I wanted to understand the contours of the moment that I found myself in. And that continues to be my abiding interest. I guess the last piece I would say is just like, overall in my work, I'm really interested in what it means to make space for Black mothers to be more complex. I mean, you used the word, Pamela, on flattening, and I'm really interested in what it means for Black mothers to not be either symbols of heroism or symbols of tragedy, and to open up more space for the everyday, the complicated, the ambivalent. So that's really what I'm trying to do in my work.
Thank you. Ilana, did you want to respond to that? I thought you might.
I don't
No?
have
Okay, sorry. Ilana, I love how you talk about that edit, or that choice that you made in your iterative process to use the implied body within this project rather than like that archival source material, which was obviously problematic. And I think that's a really interesting strategy to think about, especially when working with such personal material and family stories. So I think that's something that I think was really effective in the presentation of this work in Times Square. A kind of funny question, or something I think was funny. I didn't realize those were adult-sized nursing pillows in the installation that you have. And then, so you've got that. And then on Friday night, we had this wonderful gathering in Times Square for like a collective viewing of the work with performances from Ashley Greer and Shea Buford singing us a sort of lullaby. So we're all becoming baby in a way with your work. So can you tell us about that, that sort of scale shift that you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I like that. We are all becoming baby. I think the first time I showed the video, it was in the space that's this big, dark, like womb-like space too. And like I made that when you see it in the physical installation, the bass heartbeat is actually playing from a separate speaker that shakes the floor physically when you're sitting there. And that is based off of I got like binaural recording microphones, so you wear it over your ears, and I recorded like myself lying on my mom's chest, or my niece lying on my sister's chest, and like directly, and sort of replicated that heartbeat that you might hear. And I think that I want to go back to Times Square to see how people react to it again. But I actually like that it did feel like all of a sudden some sort of calm or sense of being held came just briefly over the freneticism of all of those like screens, that it was that the neutral color somehow or something like that could give a moment of calm. So I think I'm interested in how a work could hold an audience while also presenting them with difficult content. That it could do both of those things. It could be generous that way. And I guess I need to hear more from other people how they actually experience it. But I like the idea that it might be able to do that.
Yeah, that's such a nice way to put it, of holding an audience on a couple of levels. I wanted to talk to you both about fantasy, and you've touched on it a bit, so it's okay if you don't want to expound, but just thinking about like how you engage or resist a Black femme or Black maternal fantasy and the role that fantasy plays in this context in particular for you, Ilana.
So fantasy being like whose fantasy do you mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh,
An external fantasy or our fantasy for ourselves, you know, sort of either fabulation or an assumption of how we are to perform.
Yeah, I think like and so in the excerpt I played from the video for you all, I have my mom is kind of, I have it like reading an adapted version of that scene from Song of Solomon, the breastfeeding scene where Milkman's mother is breastfeeding and has that moment, right, that she looks forward to in the day, or the one moment where she feels like she has control over her day when she's breastfeeding him, that then kind of transforms into a site of shame for the character later in the community. But I swapped out the pronouns, right? So the he that describes the son, I switched for she. And so I like this idea that it could become confusing, like who is doing what, or where one person's body begins and another one's ends, and who is enjoying what when, that fantasy could kind of spread out or become confusing, or it would be everyone at once, and that it could be one that is both inward in that way and expansive through like direct contact between people. And I think for me often, and like also in the space of fantasy, of looking just like too closely at a material till I get to sort of almost make up stories about what it is or what it's for. In this case, I don't have any like actual milk, but I was using lots of ingredients that go into formula sometimes, and milk substitutes, and playing around with the macro lens in front of the macro lens, like the different kinds of viscosities and things like that and how they moved. But I was curious, like when I showed it in Times Square and folks were like, I really love the part where the milk is like flowing over human flesh or something, brown skin. And I like that, folks, that's not happening. There's no part where that happens. But so I'm curious about too, when you look at something too close, how it could suddenly become stars or skin or like all kinds of other things. But yeah, I guess that's when you say fantasy, those are the initial thoughts that come to my mind.
Yeah, and I'll add a couple of other thoughts. I mean, one of the things that really interests me about kind of larger cultural discourse about breastfeeding writ large is that it's not work and that it's free. So you often hear both of these things, right? Like breastfeeding is, really, it's a great economic decision because it's free, and also a lot of the conversation about breastfeeding presumes that it's easy, which is why, Ilana, when you mentioned, someone saying like it's hard, like I really appreciated that intervention, because I'm interested in all those things as fantasies that shore up the idea that that what women do is not work, right? Like breastfeeding is work. It's hard. It's demanding. Not everybody can do it. There's a lot of affect attached to it, feelings of guilt and shame when you can't do it. And of course, it's not, as you said, with your large breastfeeding pillows, right? The accoutrements of breastfeeding are plentiful, and so it's often not free. And also, a lot of it is pumping and not breastfeeding, right? So we often talk about breastfeeding as about physical attachment, but because of the way work is structured, most breastfeeding is actually pumping. So I'm really interested in those fantasies, that it's not work and that it's free. I'm really interested in the fantasies, and I showed some of Lakeisha Cohill's photographs, and I love her work. Her work is on the cover of my book. I'm really interested. I talk about her work as kind of this fantasy landscape, right, where Black mothers, through their bodies, through putting their bodies to work, can save or protect their children from violence that's to come. And I really see that to be the message that's embedded in her visual labor, right? That through breastfeeding, you're offering your child an early immunization against anti-Black violence. And I'm interested in that as a fantasy, right? Because I don't think any of us can be immunized or saved from anti-Blackness, and I don't think we should put that labor on Black mothers. And so I'm really interested in that kind of fantasy. And then the last piece is, some of this comes up in Lakeisha's photographs as well, and you gestured to this, Ilana, is the ways in which ideas about the past and history and even mythical ideas of Africa enter some of the visual logics of breastfeeding. So Lakeisha's photographs will often show images of women in nature with their faces painted, and she will talk in some of her interviews about how breastfeeding is kind of going back to this native practice, to this thing that we've always known how to do. And so I'm really interested in what kind of fantasies about Black women's histories get talked about when we're talking about breastfeeding. Again, also because so much of the breastfeeding that's actually happening is not as she's representing it, right? Is often behind a door in an office, pumping. So those are some of the fantasies that I try to track and destabilize in my work.
That like nativist fantasy, back to nature fantasy feels so parallel with, Ilana, what you're exploring with wellness culture. Like, you know, so much of this expensive stuff that we're being sold and like practices are rooted in this, like, go back to the original thing, but it's going to cost you way more. It's going to be super inconvenient. So it's also that goop privilege thing at the same time. And yeah, I think with your work, Ilana, like I'm really interested in how you use that seductive imagery, you know, even like the macro image of the bubbles, but find a way to resist fetishization, and also be critical of it. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like,
yeah, I mean, I guess, like, I think, yeah, maybe it's like resisting fetishization of like as like my body from an external vantage point of Black women's body. But I think there is a sort, for me, like I just have a sort of fetishization of liquids and like, and like
I feel you.
the process of like being in the studio, you know, as an artist, the like alchemical process that happens either when materials are under studio lighting or just like that time when like art is like your art is in a state of becoming. And I like that in this context or this piece that the material of milk too becomes a state of becoming between like human bodies or between bodies, but also like that there I could somehow conflate those two different kinds of making we have like of our ideas and how there's a conduit from hand to object as an artist, and also the making of the other, the making between people as well. And I think like I really started thinking about this, especially when Lord is taught in the uses of the erotic, the speech when she's talking about needing the bag of margarine, you know, and she says that they had these white plastic, like these plastic packets of white uncolored margarine with the yellow kernel on top. And then it's like this pivot, right, in the speech, right, where all of a sudden she's talking about leaving it out to soften. And she says she knead it gently back and forth over and over until the whole pound bag of margarine is thoroughly colored. That you want to see the erotic, like the yellow kernel within herself. And I always thought that line is so amazing, but also just because it's almost like the perfect recipe, right? But then also the food becomes a proxy for the body in a certain way, right? But it's a from her vantage point, you know, it's wholly from her vantage point that it becomes this proxy for the body. So yeah, I think touch, the VDC of touch that's outside of just, I think oftentimes fetishization is so about when it becomes totally just visual. From the like the seeing and thinking and distance and apprehending, but that sort of haptic experience or a touch or a notion through touch is really interesting to me as well.
Yeah, thank you.
I feel like sometimes I go on tangents and I don't properly answer questions, but I
hope that's what we're here for. I mean, this is our moment to think about these things expansively. So that was a wonderful thing to think about with the haptic. Dr. Nash, were you gonna add something?
Yeah, I mean, I was, you know, just when you were talking about, you started the question, Pamela, by thinking about fetishization. And I love this moment where Kimberly Hours, I've read the quote, says something about, we need to save ourselves. We're comfortable with Black women's breasts selling chicken wings, but we're not comfortable with Black women's breasts as a site of kind of feeding life, right? And I find that moment so interesting. Like I'm really fascinated by the idea of Black women's breast as a kind of cultural fetish. Bell Hooks has this famous essay called Selling Hot Pussy, where she starts by talking about walking into a restaurant in a small Midwestern town with some colleagues, and there was a sea of chocolate breasts being displayed in this restaurant, and her colleagues all laugh, and she sees these chocolate breasts as a sign of a displaced longing for a racist past, and she's not laughing at all. And so she starts her essay by thinking about the Black breast as a kind of fetish object. And so I'm really interested in the ways in which, for like someone like Kimberly Sears Allers, when she's like, oh no, Black breasts, when they're reproductive, they're not sexual, which is interesting in and of itself, that like the reproductive and the sexual are thought of as mutually exclusive, but that there's something about the nursing Black breast that is outside of this kind of fetish economy that so many Black feminist scholars have wanted to trouble. So I'm really interested in that, and always interested in what happens to the place of like sexuality. Ilana, you mentioned Lord's eroticism. Like how can we hold space for thinking about Black maternal figures and sexuality and pleasure and eroticism simultaneously, right? Rather than holding on to this idea that to be mother is to be asexual, right? Which I think has permeated so much of the Black feminist literature on Black motherhood, that when you're a mother, you've risen above the profane, right? So yeah, that's just what your question made me think of.
Wonderful, thank you. I think just when you talked about the pumping, and pumping being like how breastfeeding is done most of the time, one of the things that I was really drawn to, Ilana, in your work was how it's rooted in the haptic, but also in a mechanical sense of breastfeeding. So I guess my last question is just about that and how you came to that focus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think I wanted to see when I started going through the archives, and I was looking at these old historical tools, but then I just got really interested too in the I'm often interested just in tools and like the promises that they have for how they're going to optimize or make your life better and things like this. And then, so I just started going down these rabbit holes of like contemporary breast pump instruments and like accoutrements and who can afford what, and the Bluetooth enabled ones and the this and that. And which is real, it's real apparently. I was someone who has one. But so then I just started to buy sort of just that for my studio, like the different component parts, then to just see what would happen. And I started to experiment with them and see how things sort of move through them. And that's what led me to this like constantly pumping milky substance sculpture that I made, which I'm still figuring out what to do with, was that just seeing like what happens when these things are in action or become useless, like their promised use value is kind of taken away and the instrument gets to just sort of pump, but just to like evaporate.
Thank you. Yeah, the useless tool is something you keep coming back to in your work, right? Like, yeah, that, I mean, some people say that's about failure or something, but I think it's much more interesting to think of it as a useless tool, which is parallel to some of the conversations about motherhood and the desire to have a useful body, so to speak. And thank you both so much for joining and engaging in this conversation. There's so much to cover, and I feel like, each of these threads that we slightly tugged at could just keep unraveling. So thank you so much for engaging with them all. Exactly, Brittany, a whole conference, like a whole lifetime. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pamela. Thank you, Ilana. Thank you, Dr. Nash. Many thanks to all of y'all for joining us this evening to hear more from these incredible speakers. If you'd like to learn more about them, there are many opportunities to dig into their work with a couple of current projects. As we know, Liquid Gold by Ilana Harris-Babou, still on view from Times Square, is this month's Midnight Moment until May 31st. It plays every night this month from 11:57 p.m. to midnight. And a longer version of Liquid Gold by Ilana was commissioned, as Ilana shared earlier, for the current exhibition Milk at the Wellcome Collection in London. And the exhibition explores a relationship with human and dairy milk and its place in politics, society, and culture. That'll be on view until September 10th. Dr. Jennifer C. Nash's Birthing Black Mothers, published by Duke University Press, is available now wherever books are sold. And Pamela Council's work. Some of Pamela Council's work can currently be seen in the exhibition Artists Choose Parish, on view through August 6th at the Parish Art Museum in Watermill, New York. Please check out the links as well from Pamela in the chat. Artists Choose Parish is a landmark exhibition honoring the East End's rich artistic legacy and brings greater attention to major artists practicing there today. So thank them all. Many thanks as well to Liam Archer, my Times Square Arts colleague, for keeping us all afloat here and running the show behind the scenes. And lastly, thanks again to everyone for joining us. That's it. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good night. Thanks, everyone.